Hello friends. So till now we have studied about different kinds of quantities in our chapter motion. We studied about distance, displacement, speed, velocity and the most important acceleration. So all these quantities that we have studied are one in the other way help us to determine the motion of an object. Now you may wonder why the motion of an object is important. It's because motion of an object helps us to understand the nature, the different quantities, the qualities of an object. For example, if we talk about motion of celestial body, so how you come to know that earth used to rotate or earth used to revolve around the sun? How did you come to know this? Just because you calculated, or the scientists who worked on this field in this field calculated the motion of celestial bodies. They used to see the acceleration, the distance traveled, the displacement, the time, the speed and various other quantities they used to calculate using their instruments. Okay, but it is difficult for us to understand the or to grasp or to take out the information from the data. Okay, for example, if I talk about, the scientists used to measure the velocity of earth every time. For example, they are measuring the velocity of earth every second. So just imagine in a single hour we have 3600 seconds. Okay, in 1 hour we have 3600 seconds. So imagine how many seconds in 1 day, imagine how many seconds in 1 week, or in 1 month, or in 1 year, or in 1 century. So it's a huge data. Okay, if I calculate the velocity of earth every second, then that will give me a huge data. So it would be difficult for me to analyze that data, to understand that data, that how exactly earth is behaving, that how exactly the velocity of earth is changing, or is it a constant velocity. So all these kinds of data is difficult to understand if it is in bulk. Okay, if it is very big data, then it would be difficult for us to understand the motion, or understand or draw the conclusion, or take some inference from the data. That's why we developed one more very interesting concept. Okay, and through that concept we are very much familiar in our day-to-day life, and we have seen that concept most of the time in, let's say, cricket matches, or let's say in some other let's say football, or there are various other sports and various other quantities that we used to see in our daily life, and that concept is known as graphical representation. That quantity is known as, that concept is known as graphical representation. Graphical representation helps us to determine, to draw the conclusion, to take out the information from a given data. Okay, so why the graphical representation is a very important concept? The importance of this concept lies in the fact that it presents visual form of data. It presents visual form of data. Just imagine, just remember, in the cricket match you have seen there is a graph, there is a bar graph which shows the number of overs and run scored in every over. It will give you a graphical form, it will give you bar graphs. You have studied about bar graph. So it will give you a bar graph, then line graph, and there are various other types of graphs available with us, and through that we can represent the complete data in a visual form. So this is the most important thing in this concept of graphical representation, that the data is represented in the visual form. Okay, just remember this. This is the significance of graphs. Now, why we want to represent it in the visual form? Why is it not that if I make a table and I understand the data from it? Why is it possible? Why it is so? It's just because visual form gives a better understanding of a given data. Okay, now what exactly is visual form, how the data is represented? Let's understand this. See, as I said that in cricket match we have seen there is a number of overs and the runs scored in each over is shown in a graph form, okay, in a graphical form. You have made the histograms and bar graphs in your earlier classes in statistics topic. So what you have exactly made, or what exactly in the cricket it shows? It basically shows the number of overs, okay, the number of overs played by a particular team and the runs they scored in every over. So it means I have two quantities with me. One quantity is number of overs, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and overs, and second quantity is number of runs scored in every over. So these are the two quantities, and in a graph I used to show a relation between these two quantities. So the most important thing here is that graphical representation, it shows a visual form of relation between two quantities, or we can say variables. We also call it as variables, or we can say it as quantities. So this is the most important fact about graphical representation. It shows the relation between two quantities, okay. So this is most important. Two quantities. Now what kind of quantity they can be? They can be anything, okay. They should have some physical relation in them, and in that way we can use the graphical representation to show the relation, to show the, or to visualize the relation between two quantities, okay. This is the most important thing. Now what kind of quantities we have studied about? We have studied about distance, we have studied about displacement, then we have studied about speed, then velocity, then acceleration, okay, or we can say retardation as well. Now what is retardation? It's just the negative acceleration is known as retardation. We have studied this, and with this quantities, the most important quantity which is used in relation is time, okay. Time is the most important quantities through which, or which is the most important in the graphical representation. With respect to time, with the relation to time, we can show all these quantities in the graphical form, okay. Now what is a graph? If I talk about a graph, you can see a graph is it's a plane in which we have two axes. One is a horizontal axis and another is a vertical axis. We call this as, this horizontal axis as x axis and this vertical axis as y axis, okay. This is a x axis and this is y axis. This is known as the positive x axis, this is known as the negative x axis, but we will not go in the much deeper case in that. You will study that in mathematics in coordinate geometry topic. For now, just understand this is the x axis, this is the y axis, and the point where these two lines intersect is known as origin, okay. The point where these two lines intersect is known as origin. So what we can say, in a graph we have two quantities. So in cricket you might have seen a graph like this. If I talk about a graph, you might have seen a graph in this manner. Here they used to write overs, okay, and here they used to write runs. So let me write it like this. This is the runs and this is overs. And in the cricket match, at the end you might have seen that there are bars like this, okay. So what exactly is this? This is a bar graph. What it is showing, that in the first over, let's say this is the first over, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, 7, these are the overs, and this is the runs. Let's say this is 5 runs, this is 10 runs, and so on. So what we can visualize from it, that in the first over the team scored 5 runs, in the second over they scored 10 runs, then in the third over they again scored 5 runs, then in the fourth over they scored, let's say, 3 runs, or in the fifth over they scored, let's say, 12 runs, and sixth over it's again 3 runs, and seventh over it's, let's say, again 13 runs. So what we can see, the complete data, the complete details of the over and the runs scored in each over is shown in this kind of graph. So what you can see, this is the visual representation. And if I want to make a line graph, what we can do, in your class 8th or 7th you have studied the line graph, that if you join the middle points of these bars, this will give you a line graph like this. So this is a line graph. So what exactly is line graph? Line graph is nothing but again a form of graph which can show the relation between two quantities. So the most important thing you need to remember is we have to show the relation between two quantities using the graphical representation, or in the other way we can say graphical representation is used to show the relation between two quantities. So why we are using it? It's because we need to show the relation between two quantities. We have variable quantities, we have different kinds of quantities, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, this 5 and this 6th quantity. So these 6 quantities can be represented on the graph, and it will help us to understand the motion of an object. So what we can say, we are using graphical representation to show the motion of any body. Okay, this is our use. See, this is the basic general use of graph, but why we are using? Just because we want to show the motion of any body. We want to understand, we want to analyze the motion of a body using the graphical representation. So what kind of graphs we will going to make, how the graph can be made? These are some questions that may come in your mind, that how we can make the graph, what exactly is meant by when we talk about graphical representation of these quantities. See, as I told you, it shows the relation between two quantities. So we can choose any of the two quantities from these quantities. We have 6 different quantities, we can choose any 2 quantities and we can make a graph. Okay, but that should be logical. The graph that we are going to make should be a logical form, it should be a logical graph. So what exactly is meant by logical graph? For that you have to follow some rules to make the graph. The basic rules for the graph is that, as you can see, these are the 2 quantities. Okay, now always in cricket you will see that overs, number of overs is represented in horizontal axis, while the number of runs scored or the number of wickets taken is generally marked on this vertical axis. So why it is so? Why cannot I mark this overs on this vertical axis and runs on this horizontal axis? Why it is not possible? It is possible, but we will not follow that convention. Okay, we will not use that. It's because it's very simple rule that those quantities which are independent of any other quantity will going to come on horizontal axis. Okay, this is a general rule. The general rule says that on the horizontal axis we will always plot those quantities which are independent of other quantities. Okay, so let's write the rule. The very important rule that we need to follow is only those quantities or variables which are independent of other quantities will be taken or plotted on horizontal axis. Okay, we will follow this rule that only those quantities which are independent of any other quantity will going to come on horizontal axis. Okay, that's why in cricket you will not see ever that overs is plotted on vertical axis while this runs is plotted on horizontal axis. You will never find that. Okay, it's a very simple rule that the runs are dependent on overs. Okay, so priority is overs. Once the overs are done, then only we can calculate the runs. Okay, so if the over is not completed or if the over is not done, then how can we calculate the runs in that over? Okay, so that's why we will plot overs on the horizontal axis, because it's an independent quantity. Now if we talk about independent quantity in our case, that is in motion, we have these 6 quantities, and in these 6 quantities only this time is an independent quantity. The time is independent quantity, so we will plot time on the horizontal axis. We will always plot on horizontal axis. So this may be a question of Viva, that why the time is plotted on horizontal axis, why can't we plot any other quantity on horizontal axis? The simple reason for this is that time is an independent quantity, so the independent quantities can only be the horizontal axis, can only be plotted on horizontal axis. Other quantities which are not independent, which are dependent on something, okay, for example here runs is dependent on overs, okay, then we cannot, that's why we cannot use runs on the horizontal axis. Similarly, if I talk about here, so all these quantities are dependent on time. Now why it is dependent on time? Because in given time the object will travel some distance or displacement or changes its speed or velocity or acceleration. Okay, so just need to consider, just need to consider that time is one of the independent quantities. So the graphs that we will going to study, what graphs we will going to study is, we will choose some quantities from this and time. Okay, we will choose one of the quantity from this and time, and we will plot a graph. So the basic graphs that we have to study are distance time graph. Okay, the distance time graph. See, distance is one quantity, time is another quantity, and graph. So graph shows the relation between two quantities. So in the distance time graph, we will plot distance on horizontal axis and time on horizontal axis and distance on vertical axis. Okay, so this is on vertical, this is on horizontal. Similarly, we will going to study velocity time graph. Again, in velocity time graph, what should be considered on horizontal and what should be considered on vertical? You can simply say time is the horizontal and velocity is the vertical axis. Okay, and then acceleration time graph. Okay, acceleration time graph, again acceleration is dependent on time, time is not dependent on anything, so time will be on horizontal and acceleration will be on vertical axis. So the most important that we have to study are these two graphs, and we will going to study, we will see a basic of this acceleration time graph as well if required. Okay, these two are the most important. We have to study these two because using these two we will going to derive some equations as well, which we call as equations of motion. Okay, so please focus on these two graphs properly. Okay, so first you note this and then we will start discussing about distance time graph.